Welcome to the NatRefs Show, a weekly podcast on the ever-changing world of natural refrigerants, brought to you by Shecco, with support from component maker Teco. Today, we will be discussing the major news items impacting the world of natural refrigerants. My name is Michael Garry, editor of Shecco's Accelerate America magazine and North American editor for Shecco, and I will be hosting today's podcast from Shecco's New York area bureau outside of New York City. I'm joined today by my colleagues in Brussels, Belgium, Charlotte McLaughlin, who's Shecco's European-based reporter, Marie Battesti, part of the market development team, and we'll also be hearing from Andrew Williams, the European editor for Shecco, and Alvaro, our COO, who will be reporting from South Africa. So, first of all, hello, Charlotte and Marie. How are you?
Hello. We're good, thank you.
Hi, Michael.
Very good. Okay. So today, the topics we'll be discussing will be the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's a group of states that are doing some interesting things environmentally and with HFCs reduction. I'll be highlighting some of the major events going on at the ATMOsphere America conference next week in California. We'll be talking about the soaring HFC prices in Europe. And then again, we'll be hearing from Andrew and Alvaro from South Africa talking about the FRIGAIR conference and the ATMOsphere Network event taking place in Johannesburg. So we'll start off with news from the United States. The U.S. Climate Alliance is a very interesting organization. It really formed in response to the Trump administration's withdrawal of the U.S., or plans to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Accord. It's a bipartisan coalition of governors from 16 U.S. states and from Puerto Rico, which basically came together to pursue a climate agenda that would help the U.S. meet the goals of the Paris Accord, despite the Trump administration's posture. So what they did recently was they announced a commitment to reducing short-lived climate pollutants, which of course includes HFC refrigerants. The Alliance is doing quite a few things on the climate change front, but one of them is now concerning short-lived climate pollutants and HFCs. So they plan to release an action plan at the upcoming Global Climate Action Summit in September of this year. In the coming months, this alliance is going to work to comprehensively address short-lived climate pollutants. And as I say, that includes the phase-down of the use of HFCs. And the alliance is inviting all national and subnational businesses, jurisdictions, and other actors to bring commitments to reducing short-lived climate pollutants to this conference, the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco this September. So the Alliance is urging all parties to call on government and business leaders to take action on this issue, and it's even set up some social media hashtags like the SLCP challenge hashtag. And so, of course, California, as we know, is the most proactive state when it comes to the environment, and they're part of the alliance. And of course, they've been doing taking a lot of action with respect to reducing HFC emissions in the last few years. Another state that's now become active on the HFC reduction front is New York State. Governor Cuomo recently directed state agencies to develop a comprehensive plan to reduce HFC emissions through a suite of incentives and regulations. So the incentive part is very significant because California, through its new California Cooling Act, is working on incentives for low GWP systems like natural refrigerant systems. So,
and in New York, the incentives, are they just for low GWP refrigerants, or are they just aimed at natural refrigerants?
I believe they would probably be for low GWP, California as well. But when they say low GWP, that certainly includes the natural refrigerants, since they are extremely low GWP.
Are they like qualifying that by, I don't know, a GWP count, like everything below 150, or
right?
Do you know any specific
They haven't done
details?
that so far in New York, but that's what they're doing in California, capping the GWP at 150 for new refrigeration systems. So I would think, California usually establishes a model for other states and even for the federal government to follow. The EPA has picked up on a lot of what California has done over the years. So probably these other states will do something similar, I would say. But the main point is that, there's two main points. One is that the states are acting independently of the federal government to address climate change and incorporating the reduction of super pollutants like HFCs in the mix. So, it's an encouraging thing for those of us in America who care about the environment, and then for the rest of the world to see that America is not completely shirking its responsibility. And these 16 states make up a huge portion of the U.S. economy. It's a lot of the big states like California, New York. So makes up a lot of people and a lot of money in the economy. So it's very significant. And of course, it's significant that they're among the things that they're looking at are not just the traditional fossil fuel emissions of carbon, but also the emissions of the short-lived super pollutants, like methane and HFCs. So that puts natural refrigerants on the table as a replacement system for HFCs, and gives a lot more gives a lot more attention to natural refrigerants. So this is a very significant thing and very exciting. And I'm so pleased to see that there are things going on in America a lot like this, that we haven't completely lost our minds here. Last thing I want to mention, ATMOsphere America next week. I'm really excited to be heading out to California to participate in this great event, which really brings together everybody who's involved with natural refrigerants and many end users as well. So it's going to be a really cool event. We're going to hear from the great Pega Herniak, professor in the University of Illinois, who's an expert and a world-renowned researcher in refrigeration. We're going to hear from Senator Ricardo Lara, who's the author of the bill to bring incentives to natural refrigerants in California. We have a utilities panel with Southern California Edison and the California Energy Commission and others. That's going to be really interesting because utilities are, of course, also providing incentives. We're going to have a great policy session with the California Air Resources Board and International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, talking about the new charge limits for hydrocarbons. We have a great industrial refrigeration panel that I'll be chairing with a lot of great end users. Also, food retailer panel that I'll be moderating, and I'll be giving out the Accelerate America Awards, which are 6 awards that recognize people doing great things with natural refrigerants at a dinner on the second night. And then finally, we're going to have to finish the conference, the Future of the Industry debate with all the major associations, debating and discussing what's going to be happening in the future of refrigeration, which I think is going to clearly include a lot of natural refrigerants.
Okay, it sounds good, Michael.
Yes, and looking forward to it. And I encourage those of you who would still like to sign up and register to do so at atmo.org, particularly people in California, because we're going to have a lot of the politicians there. Okay, so and we're now going to hear from my colleague in Brussels, Marie, who's going to talk about this interesting new report on HFC prices.
Yes, so basically 2 weeks ago, Co2 Research, which is an organization doing environmental research and monitoring in Germany, organized a webinar with the European Commission. So Co2 Research is the organization working on behalf of the European Commission to monitor HFC prices since the EU F-gas regulation was implemented in 2014. So basically, in this regulation, the Commission has the obligation to monitor the prices to see the impact of their policy and how it's affecting the market. So, as an important background, for those who don't know, there's a quota system within this policy. So it's every year, or depending on the threshold, there's a new quota of HFCs available to be placed on the market, which consequently is affecting the prices due to the scarcity. So yeah, basically the target is to reduce overall the European Union's HFC use by 79% by 2030. And to this end, since this 1st of January, there's been a 37% cut of available HFC quotas in the EU market. So it raised the prices of HFCs enormously. And Co2 Research, through its webinar 2 weeks ago, released Q1 2018 prices. So it's extremely striking because they explain that before the regulation was implemented, so in 2014, HFC prices were below 2 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. Now it went up until 23 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, which is more than 1,050% increase. So there's a huge market opportunity for natural refrigerants as they seem even more competitive compared to HFCs. And obviously, it's a small investment as they are future-proof, because no regulation is never going to ban or limit the use of natural refrigerants for environmental purposes. So for those in the US, 2 euros is approximately $2.40. And now HFC prices jumped between $8.30 to $27 approximately. So you see a big gap, which is obviously great news for natural refrigerants.
Right. So the price range reflects the different parties who are selling the HFCs, right? So it starts at the low end from the people who make the HFCs, the producers, and then the higher prices are by the service people who service the equipment. So that's really where you have to look, because that's what you'll be paying. You know, if you buy it off the street, that's what you'll be paying in the higher range. Yeah.
So obviously they pay the highest price. So in the webinar, she gives the research center gives the prices throughout the supply chain, but obviously most people would pay attention to the selling price in the end. And it's also important to notice that HFC prices vary because the quotas depend on the global warming potential of the refrigerant. So that's why I'm saying HFC prices now are approximately between $8 and $27, because it depends on the GWP. Mm-hmm. But the most commonly used HFCs in Europe, such as R404A or R410A, have a very high GWP and are very impacted. And just as a side note, so this is the EU regulation that is making this. So every country, the 28 members now are affected. And on top of that, more and more European countries are implementing taxes on HFCs, meaning that the installer, for example, or people buying the equipment with the HFC price are affected by a double burden, which is this EU regulation pushing HFC prices very high, as well as the tax. For example, in France, normally now it's almost sure an HFC tax will be implemented on 1st January 2019, and it should be a progressive tax, as they call, from 30 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. So I assume a little more in dollars, but it's rather similar, up until 2030, where it would be 80 euros tax per ton of CO2 equivalent on HFC. So it would be a luxury now to work with HFCs, honestly. So not a smart investment for the long term with what's happening, at least in Europe, but a great market opportunity for natural refrigerants. And Spain also has a tax at the moment, Denmark, and the good thing is that those countries, at least for France and Denmark, are supporting at the same time low GWP alternatives, including natural refrigerants, in order to help the industry to do this transition. Because obviously the argumentation against the tax from the industry is that they are not ready, the workforce is not trained. So for example, France is considering that part of the money of the tax would be taken to support alternative refrigerants in alternative refrigerants, and it would be a 30% amortization, over amortization mechanism, as they say. So 30% of the money from the tax would go to help NatRefs and among others.
Well, it's very interesting, for an American to see all that's going on in Europe and the EU. I mean, they're so proactive and aggressive in environmental regulations, and here we're talking about getting rid of HFCs. They're doing a tremendous job with all of these phase downs and quotas and driving the price up and taxing it. I mean, it's really taking aim at these HFCs, whereas here in the U.S., and I wrote about this in the cover story of Accelerate America. I call it a policy quagmire because, this court case reversed the EPA's ability to regulate HFCs, and it's thrown everything into chaos. And we're all and we still haven't ratified Kigali, and we're trying to figure out, what to do. And California is sort of stepping into the breach, and really. It's a mess, which everybody can read about in my article, but we're going to discuss it at Atmosphere. But so it's really encouraging that Europe is still taking a leadership position on this.
Yeah, it makes me think of your article about this letter of support to ratify the Kigali Amendment from, if I recall, 32 top industry representatives. Yeah, and they are advocating that in the US, the industry is prepared for the Kigali Amendment, and it's actually a business case, and that they would lose money and jobs if the US didn't ratify Kigali and implemented the HFC phase down. So it's in everybody's interest. And indeed, at least in Europe, I know that part of the argumentation for those kind of policies is the fact that we can still be competitive globally, especially facing the development of, for example, China and its hydrocarbons-based equipment, or Japan and CO2. So I guess it's also in the US interest to implement those kind of policies. So hopefully policymakers will realize it, because the industry is already on board. So
right, absolutely. Industry's on board. Everybody's clamoring for it. So then why isn't it happening? Well, because we have an unusual government at the moment, which is not always cooperative when it comes to environmental progress, and that's the reason. But you never know; things are constantly changing, and we hold out hope that the policy people will do the right thing. And I think at the end of the day they will, and that the U.S. will get on board with the natural refrigerant revolution. So we're now going to turn to another part of the world where two of our colleagues, Andrew and Alvaro, are in South Africa reporting on the FRIGAIR conference and the ATMOsphere networking event. So over to Andrew and Alvaro.
Okay, thanks Michael. Yes, here we are at the FRIGAIR 2018 exhibition in Johannesburg, where we spent a few days exploring the HVAC&R market here in South Africa, also hosting our ATMOsphere FRIGAIR network event. Alvaro, here we are on the final day. What would you say your impressions of the event and the kind of market for natural refrigerants here in South Africa is more generally?
Hello Andrew. Well, I have a very good impression from the event. I think it was quite, it generated a strong attention, definitely. We have over 120 people participating. And they also did the very end, very much focused on the discussions. I feel that a lot of them, they learned something new, which is really useful, and is the main purpose of what we do, this kind of events. And we had excellent presentations, actually. In one breaking news announced at ATMO, the representative for the Department of Environment in South Africa, Obed, he announced that there will be a piece of legislation to control HFCs. So similar to what is happening in other parts of the world, also in South Africa, you will see restrictions to the use of HFCs going forward. And this is probably going to be even more ambitious than the commitments made as part of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So for me this is very significant because it shows us that the ministry wants to help the development of alternatives and notably natural refrigerants. We also had presentations from Woolworths. They've been doing great progress with installing CO2 in their stores, and by now they have nearly 20% of all the stores converted to CO2. Now this is very impressive given that there's no real incentive in South Africa yet. And also we heard about the largest plant of CO2 in South Africa, which is now being in works, in preparation, and it will be opened early next year. This is going to be 3 megawatts project with CO2 transcritical systems, so it's also a very impressive case study. We also heard, of course, about the topic of training, very important, some relevant initiatives in this country as well taking place, and a very interesting presentation from Danfoss about the history of natural refrigerants and notably CO2 and the different stages, and how now with the new technology, particle compression, ejectors, etc., you have the possibility to also make it efficient in all warm climate conditions. So overall very interesting, and for me the main lesson I get from here is in a market that has literally no incentive so far to move away from HFCs, there is already quite a lot of progress. It's one of the most advanced markets when it comes to developing CO2 solutions. There is a great openness to learn more, and from many of the manufacturers, the suppliers, there seems to be a very good attitude to working with natural refrigerants. So we do expect quite a big development over the coming years.
Yeah, thanks Alvaro. I would agree. I think a good message from Obed Baloyi from the Department of the Environment at the end of his presentation. He basically said exactly how you just concluded. The formula for success is government and industry working together with commitment. We as South Africa know what we need to do. That's how he concluded his presentation. So it's about all the different stakeholders coming together to put in place the solutions that are going to allow South Africa to leapfrog directly from HCFCs to natural refrigerants. That's what the government representative was talking about. Now, in parallel to the HFC side, South Africa intends to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol before it comes into effect on January 2019. That'll be the first step. And concretely, for what comes next in terms of the HFC management plan, South Africa is currently working on a Climate Change Act. And one of the explicit goals of this act, Baloyi said, is that we want to stop pumping HFCs into the South African market. So the HFC management program is going to be attached to that act. And in terms of timescale, he was saying within a year. So I think we're going to see, at least on the government side, a significant push coming.
I think something very important that it comes both from the government and also from the industry is that this opportunity of leapfrogging. For now, South Africa is of course busy phasing out ozone depleting refrigerants, and there is of course already some presence of HFCs in the market, but they can avoid a big introduction of HFCs in big amounts by transitioning directly to natural refrigerants. And one aspect that was very much highlighted and discussed is that their industry is also seeing the price increase in HFCs indirectly starting to hit the market. It's of course not as high as in Europe, and they're also seeing what is happening in Europe in other markets with the prices of HFCs skyrocketing. This is a very important signal for them to stay away from HFCs and move directly to something they know that is going to be stable, they know there's going to be a future-proof solution.
We heard this message a number of times over the last few days, the impact of the rising HFC prices in Europe, in particular in the context of the EU FCAS regulation. It's having a trickle-down effect here in South Africa. So even in the current absence of legislation, we just heard that it's being put in place, but even in the current absence, there's a definite market incentive for companies here to move away from HFCs in that sense. You mentioned Woolworths. The Alex Kuzma, the representative of Woolworths, he also talked about this opportunity to leap straight from HCFCs to natural refrigerants. So I think the message is kind of quite consistent between the suppliers of the technology, the users of that technology, and the government. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the coming years.
Well, and besides Woolworths, we know that in the room and participating at the event and also following very much with big attention what was being discussed, there were representatives of some of the other leading end users in the country. So Macro, Pick and Pay was there. We know that they're also starting to work with the CO2 as well, to getting familiar with the technology. So it goes beyond just Woolworths, and this is a very important message as well.
Yeah, now one of the challenges as we move towards more natural refrigerants in South Africa is training, and we also heard some interesting progress there. We had Grant Laidlaw, he's the president of the South African Institute for Refrigeration and Air Conditioning. He was talking about the need to train more installers and technicians on how to operate these natural refrigerant systems. He was talking about moving towards a safe handling license. So in his presentation, he urged the training providers, industry and industry associations to come together to decide what constitutes this safe handling license for handling refrigerants that are flammable and high pressure, such as hydrocarbons and CO2. So I think there's definitely movement towards putting in place the kind of training regimes and certification and recognition schemes that are needed to increase confidence in working with these refrigerants here in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe one last lesson that I take from the event yesterday and also from these days in FRIGAIR is that we see, and this could be a very important hub for the development of natural refrigerants in the rest of the continent. Of course, we've been hearing a lot about South Africa and the installations that are already in the country or the plans for development in the country, but many of the manufacturers and some of the presentations regarding training as well, they're also very relevant to the rest of the continent, and this can really be a first step in the development of natural refrigerant solutions to the rest of Africa. Of course, whatever is taking place in South Africa has an impact in the rest of the neighboring countries to begin with, in the southern hemisphere in Africa, and from the northern part we know from places from Ivory Coast, from Senegal, they're looking very much at what the French market is doing. Some others by affiliation, they're looking at Europe, some others more towards the southern hemisphere. So there is a very big opportunity also for the rest of Africa to develop natural refrigerant solutions going forward.
Thanks, Alvaro. That concludes our report from South Africa. Michael, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alvaro, for that great report. Well, that wraps up today's NatRefs show. I want to thank my colleagues, Charlotte, Marie, Andrew, and Alvaro, and thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on the NatRefs show.